Welcome to Speedrunner Reviews. In this series I'll be analysing games using the mindset of speedrunning. This video looks at the games from three perspectives. First, the casual experience, which is how most people first play the game. Next, the speedrun experience, including all the interesting tech and how well the game holds up as a speed game. And finally, the tool-assisted speedrun, showing what the game looks like when pushed to the theoretical limit. If you already know the game and want to jump straight to the speedrun part, I've left timestamps in the description and chapters on the video. Today we're playing Crash Bandicoot 1 for the PS1, a very enjoyable platformer. Before we get stuck into it, if you do end up enjoying this, please consider subscribing to keep up to date as it helps out the channel a whole bunch, and I should have these videos coming out about once a fortnight. So usually with these reviews I'm covering, I suppose, a more obscure game, so the reason I put this casual section in is just to give you an idea of what it's about before I talk about the speedrun. Crash Bandicoot though is a bit more well known, and I'm assuming a lot of people know what this game is already, but I will still talk briefly about, I guess, what I enjoy about the game casually and what it's all about. So it is what it looks like. This is a platformer. It's one of the very early 3D platformers, and due to that it almost plays like a 2D game. You're just running forward instead of right. And Naughty Dog were really keen to make sure that you still related to Crash Bandicoot as a character, so they put in a whole bunch of expression to the character itself. This includes levels where you're running to the right and you can see a bit more of Crash. Cutscenes at the end with Crash being very expressive. We have Crash turning around and acknowledging the player. We have some pretty detailed death animations. And not to mention entire levels where you're running towards the camera instead of away from it. So to my understanding, a lot of this was done to make you relate a bit better to the character and have it as, I guess, PlayStation's mascot. Unfortunately with this level here, I think it does impede on the gameplay a bit. Since your first time playing through the game, you're relying a lot more on your memory of what's in the level rather than actually your reflex skills in the level itself. That being said, after a few times you do get used to this one and it's not really a big issue at all. One thing that I love about this game is how it eases you off of old 2D platformers and onto new 3D platformers through the 100%ing system. You can play this game normally just as a platformer, get to the end of each level and you will beat the game any percent. But if you want 100% it, you have to collect all the boxes in each level, and if you do that you get a gem each time. This opens up colored gems which help you backtrack back and forth between the levels and 100% the whole game eventually. You do have to do some levels twice, but luckily you don't have to do too many of them twice. Now, one criticism of the 100% system in this game is that it's not entirely obvious the levels that you can't complete on the first trip. You'll notice in this level here there's a little pink gem at the end. If you have the pink gem, that'll make a platform and allow you to get the last few boxes in the level, but if you don't have the pink gem, well, you just can't complete the level 100% yet. So you might get into a situation where you go through a level, you get every single box that you can, and you realize that you've missed a whole bunch through pretty much no fault of your own. It's not an issue that you have to do backtracking, it's more that the game doesn't make it clear that you have to backtrack on that level before you've gone to the effort of collecting all the boxes. Speaking of 100%, it can be particularly brutal because you have to do the level without dying to get the gem from getting all the boxes. As far as I can tell, that's actually different on the Japanese version, so this game's one of the rare cases where the Japanese version's actually easier than the English version of the game. They have that change with how the deaths work for 100%, but also there's a level that's shorter in the Japanese version, and they've swapped some gems around in the Japanese version. Now, if you're familiar with other games in the Crash Bandicoot series, you might notice something right away about this game. Crash does not slide. Normally you can do a slide by pressing the circle button, but in this game pressing the circle button just makes you spin as well. So all that Crash really has to do is literally just jump and spin. That's it. Some people probably wouldn't like the game as much for this reason because the slide is very fun to use, but I actually did like it for this reason. I've tried doing a few speedruns across the Crash series, just seeing what it's like. Not very good speedruns, mind you, but I found that the lack of slide just made me a little bit more precise in my platforming, and I could really optimize those times down a little bit better. If you play a later game in the series with slides and try and go fast at all, you have to really carefully think about where each and every slide is placed. That means that these later games could be more enjoyable at a high level once used to speedrunning it or something, but with Crash 1 I just do really appreciate the simplicity. One thing you might also notice with later games in the Crash series is the sheer amount of gimmick levels they put in. It actually reaches a peak in Crash 3 and Crash Bandicoot Wrath of Cortex when pretty much half of every level involves some sort of gimmick. Some of these gimmicks are fun, like these ball rolling levels. But some like the flying levels I really don't enjoy that much. Some of these gimmick levels even have controls that are very confusing when you first play them as well. For that reason, I really love how much of a focus Crash 1 just has on pure platforming. I guess since it was sort of a new genre and everything, they wanted to give you mainly platforming levels and not mix it up too much yet. The only exception to this is the 2 levels where you ride this hog thing. These levels, not enjoyable. I don't really get into the gimmick levels, but luckily they're pretty short. The only big issue I have with this level is the hit detection's pretty bad on the boxes, so if you're trying to 100% it, you may have a rough time. Maybe play on the Japanese version instead, who knows. The only other bit where the game sort of takes a dip for me is the boss fights. The boss fights are really cool the first time you do them, but then all the next times you realize that it's essentially just an auto-scroller, and some of these bosses even have a bit of RNG in them. In the Japanese version as well, they gave some of the bosses more health, so just watch out for that if you're going to be playing that version. That being said, the designs are cool enough that I can see the appeal to these levels anyway. One thing that I will mention about this game is it is hard, especially levels like this where you're trying to jump across the bridge very carefully. You'll be having a lot of deaths on these levels, especially if you're trying to 100% and get all the boxes. Not to mention, if you're playing this game on the remake, the Insane Trilogy, they sort of messed up the controls and also made Crash's hitbox sort of like pill shape so that you fall off of ledges really easily. If you can get your hands on the original, I would probably play that instead. The controls are really tight, so when you move and you sort of stop moving with the D-pad, Crash will stop moving in the air right away. He projects his shadow underneath him to help you make your jumps. All the controls are there and really good, it's just the levels are quite hard. But if you're into platformers, you might find this a really enjoyable challenge. Overall, I'd say this one is definitely worth playing casually. Alright, in this part of the video we're going to talk about the speedrun, but before I talk about that, I want to tell you a little bit about speedrunning in different regions of the world. Just in case you didn't know, I live in Australia, which happens to be a PAL region. This means that our games run at 50 frames per second rather than 60, and for a lot of old games this means our games run literally 20% slower. If I want to be competitive on a lot of games for the speedrun, I have to import a console from America or Japan. And just to walk you through how intense this process can be, I want to tell you how I got my US Super Nintendo to work in Australia. I haven't actually gotten a PS2 to work, which is why I can't show you that in a Crash video. The adapter that came with the Super Nintendo is an American plug, and unsurprisingly that will not fit in an Australian outlet. If you literally just use an adapter, you'll probably blow up the Super Nintendo as well. Now, the actual tip on the Super Nintendo plug is pretty proprietary, so you have to use the US plug. So essentially what I had to do was solder together 2 different cords, one with an Australian end from an old Sega adapter and the other one with the US end. This was pretty much the only way that I could get it to work, by actually having my Super Nintendo plug in with the Australian type plug, unless I was going to buy like a $200 step down adapter or something. Over the years, I've gradually accumulated my NTSC console collection, but each one had a weird, awful barrier like this. It could be TV compatibility, it could be power compatibility, who knows. But if you want to get into the hobby and you live in a power region, sometimes this is the links you have to go to. Anyway, the whole reason I bring this up is because Crash Bandicoot as a series is fantastic. You'll notice Crash Bandicoot 1 has the record on NTSC, and power can still be pretty competitive because they compensated Crash's movement speed to make up for the lower frame rate. But if you look at the 100% run, you'll notice that's on the Japanese version, so if you live in Japan, you can run your childhood copy. And if you want to play Crash 2 in the series, you'll notice that all the top runs are on power. This is just due to some weird nuances in how the game mechanics work, but essentially, no matter what region you grew up in, if it's US, Japan, PAL region, you'll be able to play your childhood copy of one of the Crash Bandicoot games and run at a super competitive top level and get world record if you're good enough. It means that you don't have to fluff around with cords and money and all that nonsense to actually start running this series. Alright, so we're going to talk about the mechanics in this speedrun now. I just talk about movement stuff first. So Crash can run, jump and spin. And one thing to note about the spins is that they are on a timer. So if you use up a whole bunch of spins, you won't be able to spin for a little while after that, no matter how much you press that spin button. In terms of casual play, one of the most useful bits of tech is called a sub jump, and basically that means you can jump out of the end of a spin even if you're not touching the ground. The spin sort of holds your grounded state, so you can spin off a ledge and jump out of it. Something like that. So Crash looks like he's going to fall in the pit and die, but that's not the case, and it's really easy to do casually. I would recommend it. Now the next bit of movement tech I want to talk about is something called zigzagging, and it helps Crash move a bit faster. Now this might blow your mind, but if you hold forward with Crash, you'll move at 100% speed in the forward direction. If you hold right with Crash, you'll move at 100% speed in the right direction. What happens if you hold both? So what you would expect to happen is that you move at 100% speed in the forward right direction. That's how a game would normally work. But this is not at all how it works in Crash Bandicoot. So essentially it stacks your forward speed and your right speed on top of each other, and to figure out how fast that makes Crash move, we need help from our friend Pythagoras. So with a little bit of maths, you can eventually figure out that you move at 141% of the normal movement speed, which is faster than 100%. What this means is that if you run up left or down right or up right or down left, Crash is actually running about 40% faster than if you're running just straight forward. But of course, this doesn't actually help us get through the level quicker because the levels mostly go straight forward. And this is where the jumping mechanics come into play a little bit. If you jump, Crash will take a little while to turn around in the jump. It doesn't happen instantly when you turn around. So by wiggling left and right, you can actually make Crash have this diagonal movement speed, but he's still facing forward because he hasn't turned around yet. So in theory, if you could wiggle left and right during your jumps perfectly, you would actually move about 40% faster than if you just move forward. Now this effect is best shown on the boulders level. On the left we have no zigzagging and on the right we have zigzagging, and you can quickly see that by zigzagging we outrun the boulder very quickly. That extra 40% speed boost really comes into play in this level and is pretty much crucial over the entire speedrun. One thing that I will warn you if you're going to pick up the Crash series RTA is that you have to have very good thumbs and fast movement skills to do zigzagging, because you're literally, in this case, holding down and then swapping between left and right every single frame if you can. To do it optimally, you'd be doing that like 30 times a second. Now if you're zigzagging to go faster, you got to make sure that you're jumping, otherwise Crash will just wheel around on the ground. The other thing to consider is that spinning does make you go a little bit faster in Crash 1 as well. So the optimal movement is going to be to move forward with zigzagging and to spin as much as you can, just keeping in mind that you only get pretty much one spin each second, so you just need to manage that spin timer. Alright, the next thing to talk about is region differences. One of the biggest ones comes in the form of this box cutscene. On the US version, you get hit in the head with every single box that you missed in the level, but on the Japanese version, you just get hit in the head with one. This is one of the big reasons why the times are different between US and Japanese, and one of the big reasons why 100% is run on the different versions. Now, due to this box cutscene, you would think that the Japanese version is just automatically faster. I mean, that cutscene was way quicker. The difference is, though, that in the US version, you need to do your level in one streak to get that box cutscene, but in the Japanese version, you can die as much as you want. So the actual strategy used in the world record run is to die after a checkpoint if you know you're going to get that cutscene, and then just progress to the end of the level. Once you get to the end of the level, if you have taken a death on the US version, you just skip the cutscene entirely, which is even faster than that quick Japanese cutscene. This is pretty much the main reason why the 80% run is played on US and the 100% run is played on the Japanese version. I think the intentional deaths do break up the pace of the run a bit, but it's hard to argue with it given that it's faster. Going along with the theme of differences, the gems are in different locations between the US and Japanese version. On the US version you get a clear gem for Hogwild, and on the Japanese version you get the coloured green gem for Hogwild. This gem in particular is really important because it allows you to skip a level later on. It's also worth noticing that Sunset Vista and Slippery Climb are swapped on the US and Japanese version, although this doesn't have too much impact on anything. And interestingly enough, there's a level called the High Road, which is about half as long on the Japanese version. I don't know why they made this one shorter, apart from the fact that it's a pretty tricky level, so maybe they didn't want to make the game as difficult in Japan. This makes it a little bit controversial for the 100% speedrun using the Japanese version, since it misses a small part of the game. But at the end of the day, it's faster, so that's why we use the Japanese one there. Now, one really cool thing about this level change on the Japanese version is that normally the camera just stops when you get to the end of the level, but the camera keeps going on the Japanese version, and it keeps going out to the point that the US version of the level used to go to. Now, I did do a lot of checking here, and they don't have any leftover stuff after it being cut, but it's just worth noticing that this is a little effect that can happen. Now, on its own, that's pretty understandable that the high rate continues, but I did manage to find one more level that does the exact same thing, and it's Sunset Vista. So if you manage to go past the end platform, the level continues on for actually quite a while, like a really long time. And this is the only level that I can find that seems to do that, but it might lead to the theory that there was a beta cut bit towards the end of here. In fact, that beta stuff is more than just a theory, because we actually have access to the beta version of Sunset Vista. It was even shown off at GDQ back in 2016. It has some pretty funky level design, to say the least, but this really does explain why the camera continues past the end of the level in the final game. Alright, now that we've talked about some of the tech and version differences, I just want to focus on some key stuff in the run. Usually I'd spend a lot of time talking about the run itself in detail, that's the world record, but the tech pretty much says most of what you need to know here. We do stuff like dying after checkpoints to skip cutscenes, and then Teb is doing a lot of zigzagging and spinning to optimize movement. I am constantly in awe of how good the Crash Bandicoot speedrunners are at movement, and I have no hope of ever matching them myself. Some key things that you see here on top of what we've already talked about, spinning down those little green slimy bits can speed Crash up, bouncing off these enemies, but more importantly in this level, spinning when these spiky things are just about to hit Crash. Not only does the spin stop Crash from taking damage, but it actually boosts him forward a little bit. It's a weird application of something called a box boost, which I'll talk more about in the TASing section. Just talking again about zigzagging, you can really see how skilled Teb is just based on the D-pad inputs there on the left. It's a pretty fast pace, and if you do it wrong, Crash can like fly in the wrong direction, so it takes a lot of skill to master that. Now, Teb will collect some Aku Aku masks throughout the run. This just essentially gives Crash more health, but we don't really want to get invincibility in this run. Reason for that is because invincibility causes Crash to have a little cutscene at the start, and unlike future games in the series, invincibility doesn't actually speed Crash up. So it's not really worth it, and if we don't need to take a damage boost, we won't really get any of the Aku Aku masks. Since Teb is on the US version, Puppy Puppy will only take 3 hits, not 5 like in the Japanese. That's another little factor in that region difference stuff. The boss fights do get a little bit more interesting, like Ripperoo here, where you have to time TNT hits, but once you know what you're doing, it's pretty much an auto-scroller. Now, even though it's any percent, Teb will get all the boxes in the Lost City. Reason for this is then you get the green gem, which helps you skip a level later. The level that Teb skips is Castle Machinery, and you'll see just how quick the level is if you have the green gem. You might think you can make the jump across the gap to the end of level thing there, but there's like an invisible wall that blocks you, so you can't do it. One thing that I will mention back in this level is just little platforms that are coming in and out of the wall here. You can just land on those platforms if you hold forward into the wall. You don't need to wait for them to come out of the wall. A little strategy for playing casually. A level like this really shows how complex the platforming can be in this game. Not only is Teb doing it without dying, but also doing it while zigzagging, going fast, and hitting all these little ice paths which make Crash go a little bit faster there. You can just go up on the handrails in this level, but it's a bit slower because it's harder to zigzag on there. Teb also uses a really cool strategy in Sunset Vista, which I didn't even realize was a thing until I made this video here. Teb triggers a turnaround. Now, normally these are only in 100%, but essentially they just allow you to save your progress here. You only need to do one of them in 100% as well, because you just need to do the last one. But this saves Teb's progress in Sunset Vista, and then pretty much if he dies and gets a game over, it will put him through to the next level. A really, really cool strategy to skip that last bit of Sunset Vista in 80%. This level here is a really good example of like cutting corners and stuff like that. You can't cut corners too tight because the camera won't follow you, but Teb is cutting them as much as possible here. This level is always really frustrating because it looks like you can fall down onto the final end of the level, but if you try and do that, you'll just die straight away. You can see really good use of sub jumps here to cut corners and stuff, and some of the stuff where Crash is off camera doing movement can be pretty tricky to nail. Teb then gets a pretty nice level after that, kind of reminds me of Donkey Kong a bit. And after this, Teb has a boss fight with Pinstripe. It was found out kind of after the Taz was made that if you delay one of your hits on Pinstripe, the whole fight ends up being quicker. So that's one little bit of time in the any percent Taz that could potentially be saved if a new version was made. Teb then takes on Slippery Climb, and essentially it's all just about cycles here. The game can be pretty predictable if you know where the cycle is, you sort of know where to go, and all the cycles are global. Actually, fun fact, in Crash Bandicoot 3, if you wait about 5 years, the cycle timer breaks, and then pretty much all the enemies despawn. So if you want that game to be easier, just wait about 5 years. It's fair to say cycles get pretty messed up if you wait a long time in the Crash series. Teb takes on Lights Out and gets up to a lot of shenanigans involving sort of jumping on the edge of the level to avoid waiting for cycles. In this level you have to be really careful because you can actually hit enemies into boxes in the Crash series, and if you trigger the Aku Aku too quickly, what will happen is it'll sort of run out before you get to the next section. The Aku Aku is the light source in this level, so if you run out of health you're doing the level in the dark and usually end up dying because of it. Now, Crash 1 has a really cool ending in my opinion. You play this level called the Great Hall, it's sort of the second to last level, but the end of the level is literally right in front of you there. But if you have all the gems in the game, the gems form a path which lets you access a secret exit to the Great Hall, and that gives you the real credits to the game. So in the 100% run, you don't even need to beat Cortex, whereas in any percent you do. If we could find a way to get to the end of Great Hall without having the gems, then it would actually be faster to end any percent like that than it would be to fight Cortex to end any percent. That's pretty much all there is to the any percent run, but I want to talk a little bit about 100% while we're still in the speedrun section. So we'll talk a bit now about 100%. I just really want to point out there are a couple really good videos on YouTube already talking about the skips in 100%. One of them is this Peaks of Speedrunning, which is brilliant at watch, and then the other one's from Rico talking about all the gem skips in particular. These ones are going to explain it better than I can, but I'll try and talk it through a little bit at least. We start out Teb's run and you can see that Teb's getting invincibility. That's going to be a crucial tool in breaking boxes pretty quickly in this game, especially since there's a little box bridge coming up here, and by having invincibility you can just run across the bridge rather than bouncing on each individual box. But what I want to talk about a bit more are the gem skips. The first gem skip we see here is in Jungle Rollers, and essentially you have to ride this green gem up to hit some boxes up the top. But if you got invincibility and you can sort of navigate without looking, where you can just jump up there and get the boxes without needing that green gem. This saves huge time in the run because it means you don't have to do this level twice. Normally in Glitchless you would have to do this level once normally, not get all the boxes, and then come back with the green gem to get all the boxes again. Every time we skip a gem it's probably saving about 1 or 2 minutes. Literally the next level has another gem skip in it, and it involves getting across the finish line by sort of getting on top of the level screen. It's a bit weird. You can actually jump over that end of level portal if you're really precise without hitting the end of level warp and get over here, but at any rate you can just come here and break the extra boxes needed to get the gem from this level. Next level we have is this one here. So you can see that Teb sort of spins off the edge there and breaks a box with invincibility. And then there's another set of boxes coming up towards the end of the level here. You'll notice there's a yellow gem path to get to the end of the level here. Teb pause buffers a jump onto the wall there, gets hooked on the wall and jumps on some out of bounds scenery. Wall collision's a little bit janky in Crash 1, so you can do that if you're sort of moving diagonally towards a wall at a very particular position. Then Crash just sort of goes up on the scenery and breaks the extra box here. We'll see another skip like that later in Cortex Power as well. Next up we have Rolling Stone Skip, and this is one of the weirdest gem skips. Pretty much you're able to run off the edge there without triggering the death plane, and then break some of the boxes which are down in this section of the level. Normally you'd need the blue gem to get down here and it would literally load this part of the level here. You can then ride the wall back up with Crash and sort of get back inbounds where you need to be. This is one of the most recent gem skips that was found, and personally I'm still a little bit salty about it because it was found as soon as I finished making the 100% Taz. So when we see the 100% Taz, that gem skip is not in it, and unfortunately that makes the Taz lose about a minute. That's unfortunately just the nature of Tazzing. Since Tazes usually take 6 months or a year or 2 years to make, stuff is going to be found as you're making the Tazes. Now, Native Fortress is actually one level that we can't do a gem skip for. Just due to the layout, you'll want to go upwards, which is very hard to do, and the gem pretty much loads a new area with boxes. So maybe one day we could skip it, but it's not looking likely at the moment. One thing that I will mention is this little animation Crash does at the end where he sort of flinches here. That's RNG. So loading screens in this game can lose up to several seconds if you get bad luck on them. When we look at the TAS, that'll optimize all those loading screens to be as fast as possible. Coming to the Lost City, I just want to point out some of the box locations are a little bit weird in this level. You might also notice Teb died right at the start. That's to reset the global cycle timer so that Teb has consistent cycles coming through the level. Teb could have just waited, but it's a little bit quicker to die because then you know exactly where that cycle is going to be. The game can have some pretty well hidden boxes, for example this one where you have to spot the apples going off the edge and trigger a secret path. So if you're playing Crash these days, probably a good idea is to watch a walkthrough just to see where some of those boxes are, particularly if you miss them in some levels. We have Road to Nowhere here, but in the Japanese version you actually get the red gem before you come into this level for the first time, so that's another thing that makes Japanese faster, that you don't need that extra revisit. You'll also notice Teb spun the TNT in that little bit earlier without taking damage, and you can just do that if you make it out of the way of the blast radius quick enough. This level here is one that unfortunately we don't have a skip for yet. There's a little gem path at the end of the level that you're supposed to take, but the gems themselves actually load a new area, so it's going to be a little bit tricky to find a skip for this one. You will notice that little pink gem there right at the end of the level. You'd normally go down that hole by riding that gem. Speaking of RNG in this game, I will also mention that Koala Kong comes out a varying amount of time before the boulder is thrown, so that can be a little bit of an RNG effect that you got to look out for in the run. Next up is Cortex Power, and it's one of those weird examples of a Crash level that's not linear, so it's got lots of branching paths and backtracking and stuff. Normally you'd need the blue gem to get through this level, but Teb is able to skip it with a special glitch. So essentially that glitch is similar to the one we saw in Upstream before, getting hooked on the wall. So Teb's going to come to this little section of the level here and do a precise jump on the wall diagonally to sort of get latched on there and have Crash rise up the wall. You can see that it can be a bit finicky, but once you get across the wall, Crash can just fall down on the other side and reset the camera. That's not all though, because now we're sort of stuck in the gem area and you normally need a gem to get out of this area. So we're again going to have to do a similar glitch of getting hooked on the wall to escape this area here. I actually love watching this bit in speedruns because this is one contribution I made to the RTA community. This setup Teb's doing here I came up with. It's a weird little pause buffer precise thing to get a spin jump off the wall. It looks like it would be easy because it looks like you can just hit any spot on the wall, but you have to hit a very precise spot on the wall, and that pause buffer thing sort of helps you do so. So those are the main real gem skips I want to talk about. Teb then does a backtrack through the game to clean up any missed gems and heads to the Great Hall here. You can sort of see how the gems make a platform to get across the level, and if we could find a skip for this in any percent, it would save quite a bit of time, so that's probably something to look for if you're into glitch hunting. It's a really cool ending to the game as well, because it saves you having to fight Cortex, and then you get a little where are they now section from all the characters in the game. In the record it's all in Japanese, it's the Japanese version, but if you can read this text, some of it is pretty funny. So overall, I can't express how impressive all this speedrun stuff is from Teb. These world records are pretty optimized with all their zigzagging and stuff. You can see Teb is playing pretty close to that previous PB, and it's just amazing how much skill are coming out of all these Crash Bandicoot speedrunners. Alright, now we're going to talk about the TAS. There are sort of two TASs for this game. We've got the Any Percent or Baseline TAS by Purohiko, and then the 100% TAS by myself. So there's a lot of history behind this. Purohiko saved 9 minutes over the previous Any Percent TAS, and there's a couple of renditions of this one. With the 100% TAS, there were a lot of submissions beforehand, but none of them were quite optimized enough to fully be accepted to TAS videos. You can sort of see the submission history here, and you can see the time for 100% gradually coming down over the years, but it wasn't until this 56-minute run that it really was optimal enough to put on the site. Purohiko's Any Percent TAS is now 11 years old. I have had to play around with it and saved a little bit of time on some levels, but it's still pretty optimized, and a new run hasn't been made yet. So in this part of the video, I'm going to talk about some of the tech used in the TAS, and I'll focus mainly on 100% just because I'm more familiar with it. Before looking at the 100% TAS, I will point out Purohiko made an absolutely brilliant encode of this TAS, which has a whole bunch of information regarding all your position and sort of spin timers and everything. So if you want an understanding of Crash Bandicoot TASing in full with all the technical details, this is a really good encode to watch. And just in case you're wondering how Pirahikyo actually saved 9 minutes over the Taz prior to this, a lot of it was the zigzagging movement tech and stuff like that. So the Tazs themselves have the same sort of movement optimization. We got the zigzagging and the spinning to go really fast, but there's a few more little nuanced bits and pieces that we need to talk about. First one is what I call Z optimization. Essentially, it's going as forward as much as you can and just taking very slight turns left or right. Now, I actually put together like a Taz tutorial talking about this on the 8-Bit Beast YouTube channel, but essentially with Z optimization, you might run across a curvy path like this, and hey, you can literally just move straight through it, which would be much quicker than trying to ride the curves around. Same thing happens with a curvy path in Crash. Here, again, you would literally just take a straight line, you wouldn't try and hug the curve as close as possible. Next situation is this one, where if you try and take a straight path, you can't do it because the track bends around a lot. A lot of people will be tempted to sort of go straight, then hug the curve around, and then get to that end point there. Something like this path here. But it turns out that's not optimal in terms of minimizing the distance traveled. What is optimal is going from the start, taking a straight line to the corner, and then taking a straight line back to the end. The other thing that I'll mention about Crash is that you've got a forward movement speed that you want to keep as optimal as possible, and you can move ever so slightly left and right off that movement speed without losing forward speed. So your speed can actually be variable depending on your angle, but essentially you want to take very, very, very light turning angles to do whatever turning you need to do. Next thing that I want to talk about is box boosting or enemy boosting in Crash games. So pretty much every Crash game, if you jump onto a box, the collision will get really, really janky, but you can actually use the boxes to boost you forward about 1 frame worth of movement each time. Alrighty, so rather than just explaining box boosts, I really want to show you how they work in action. And to show you that, I'm going to talk about Delta P. This is a tool that I use when tazzing, really. I programmed it up as a little part of ScriptHawk. But essentially this Delta P watch that you can see at the bottom of the screen tells you where Crash is in respect to where he would be with optimal zigzagging movement. So basically the program calculates if Crash were to move perfectly, it should stay at 0, and as we go through, it essentially does stay at 0. Crash is just zigzagging forward, and there's nothing really to boost him forward or pull him back. This is optimal movement. This is also a really good tool to see if you've messed up your zigzagging. But you can see that as soon as I hit an enemy or a box or something and bounce off the back, bam, the P goes to -20. Now because we're going in the negative direction, that's actually good. So I'm 20 in-game units ahead of where I should be. And considering I'm moving at 16 units a frame, well, I've just saved a frame there by bouncing on that turtle. And I'll play out the rest of the section. You can see pretty much the P stays at -20 now because we're moving optimally. I slow down for this monkey and then I get a boost. So you've got to be really careful because I slowed down before hitting the monkey, which you think would make you lose time, but that lines up my positioning well enough to get a really big boost over that. And then the P went from 12 up to 43, which is like a boost of 30 units. So weirdly enough, it depends how much you slow down and exactly where you hit an enemy, because sometimes you get boosted forward, sometimes you get boosted back. You have to be really careful. You can see there, spinning through that box boosted me forward, and then hitting the turtle boosted me forward. I'm now at 88. Hitting the plant doesn't boost me forward, and that's just a little side effect of where exactly that plant is right now. Now these spikes you can spin on and get huge boosts forward. So I don't spin on that one because of a timer issue, but you can see I span there and I made a boost of 100, so that saved like 5 frames. And then the whole game is gradually just bumping up to P until you got what you need. There I've slowed down to 192 because I went 3 boxes and had to slow down, but here I bounce on this dude's head, spin off him to get a boost. Obviously these green bars are also going to give you a boost, so the P will get bigger there. And honestly, this is one of the best tools I've ever made to help with tazzing because, you know, you can just see where you should be and whether or not you're actually saving time. Really importantly, on that box there, I boosted up, Delta P changed, and you can see how you gradually optimize it. I'll lose a bit of Delta P here, just spinning up that green slope, but then on this monkey, I'm hoping what I do is get another boost. There we go, 411 up to 425, and by hitting a spin, you just get that little bit more boost. Again, going to slow down here, but then getting huge boosts off these little spiky things. So that really is the game with tazzing Crash 1. You're just optimizing this Delta P and inching forward compared to where you really should be in the level. It's worth noting that I've got up to 837 units in front of where I should have been if I was just doing optimal zigzagging through that whole section. So really you can divide that by about 20 to figure out how many frames we saved. And it turns out to be roughly 34 frames that you save, which is about a whole second, and that literally just comes from the box boosting and enemy boosting we were doing throughout that little section of gameplay there. You can see how this stuff adds up over time. And what I'll do here is just play out a section in full, just so you can see every of those little bits of boosting actions. Now that we're moving right, positive to P is good, so just keep that in mind. We're 124 units ahead at this point. Green slopes down, good. Up slopes, bad. Bouncing on enemies, good, as long as you can hit the front of them. And we lost a whole bunch going into this little back section here, but we retain it. And obviously you can't do a lot of boosts in that section, so you just have to keep that in mind. Boosting off enemies again, and then climbing up. And it's worth noting that this box boosting, enemy boosting tech did help me save a few frames over the any percent TAS when I tried it out, but it wasn't a big enough difference that it was worth redoing that TAS, especially since the original one has that awesome encode that's worth watching. Now, next little thing to talk about in the TAS is lizard boosting. This works a bit differently. They actually eject you out, and then crash goes really fast for a really long time. You can actually retain that speed quite a long time by jumping and spinning and stuff, but realistically, because of the obstacles in the level, you usually end up losing it pretty quickly. I'd love to have some more areas where there's lizards out in the open, but unfortunately it doesn't really happen. One little thing to mention is I'm sort of jumping around the front of the scenery as well a lot in this TAS, and that's just a thing you can do in Crash 1. It's pretty funny and pretty easy to do in a TAS setting. One thing that I'll mention as well is that the end screen relies on RNG, and this is particularly if you finish a level without all the boxes. So the box falls on Crash's head in the Japanese version, and then he sort of flinches like this afterwards. He can flinch a different amount of time, sort of depending on your luck, and it can save or lose anywhere up to 2 seconds. So RTA runners have no control over this, and I think that it wasn't known at the time of making the old any percent TAS, so that can lose a little bit of time there. But essentially, just by changing Crash's movement coming into the end of the level, you can get better luck. Sometimes you might sacrifice 2 or 3 frames, but then save like 2 seconds, so it's definitely worth it. Just on this, one thing that I want to mention is the loading differences between RTA and TAS. The RTA runners use consoles, PS2 consoles with fast disk speed, whereas the TAS essentially emulates PS1 loading times. So whenever you look at any Crash TAS compared to RTA, just keep that in mind that the loading times are going to be really different. For example, in the 100% Crash TAS, it's 55 minutes TAS time, but with the RTA time, it's 52 minutes. So it's like 3 minutes due to loading that you lose. Now, one thing you'll be very familiar with if you've played Crash games are global cycles. So you can see all these platforms here, they're all on global cycles, meaning that as soon as you turn the game on, they start moving around essentially. And you can reset them by dying, but pretty much you're going to have to wait a specific amount of time to get them into the spot that you need them. It sort of has a weird effect because it almost makes the TAS an auto-scroller in a sense if you're at the point where you're waiting for cycles. But these cycles are frequent enough that it doesn't really feel like that, and more often than not, you're just trying to optimize the TAS as best you can, and then you might lose like half a second to a cycle or something if you get bad luck, or bad cycles. There is one cycle in this game which is absolutely huge though. First of all, this box movement's just awesome. But then if you have a look at these moving platforms at the end of this path, I just barely catch this one that I'm about to jump to here. That's literally down to the frame, I've just barely caught it. And that platform moves up and down in a cycle that takes 13.3 seconds. So if I was just a tiny bit slower anywhere in the 100% TAS leading up to that, I wouldn't have caught that cycle and I would have lost 13.3 seconds. Furthermore, if I want to save any time on this 100% TAS, it wouldn't be enough to save a couple frames. I would have to save 13.3 seconds. So in some senses, these cycles are really nice because it means if I did save a frame or something, I wouldn't feel too bad about it if I were able to save it earlier on because it wouldn't have mattered. I wouldn't have hit the same cycle anyway. But they're sort of brutal because you can lose a whole bunch of time through really no fault of your own. The good thing about TASing Crash 1 is that you do have to do the levels pretty much in a set order, whereas if you're TASing Crash 3 and you can pick each set of 5 in any order you want, you have to plan out in advance what global cycles you're going to hit. And that's why when I did the Crash 3 TAS, it took me a lot longer because I basically had to TAS every permutation of levels to see what would happen and what would minimize cycle waiting time. This is also why in RTA you sometimes see runners die at the start of a level to reset the global cycles, but in a TAS that's a little bit too slow to be worth it. More often than not, you can make your way around cycles where you need to. Now we do have some tools to break the cycles. What I want to talk about next is something called a double jump, and we'll see it here. Crash sort of spins and jumps off that platform, but then gets another jump out of the air. So it's kind of weird. You clip partially into the platform and it thinks you're grounded, but you get the jump off the platform anyway. And then you can just jump out of the spin because it's almost like a sub jump or something like that. And these save a whole bunch of time in these river levels. You can see here on this leaf, what I'm going to do is spin off the edge while clipping into it, then do a double jump, and then extend my jump even further by damage boosting on this fish here. That section can look really confusing if you watch the TAS without the context. By the way, there's another double jump there as well. It can look really confusing if you watch the TAS without context, but when you sort of see what's going on in slow motion, it makes a little bit more sense. And it sort of looks like Crash is damage boosting off the water, but that is not the case at all. And these double jumps are used pretty much all over the place in this level. You can see this cycle here is going to be too wide to hit, so what do? I double jump off the leaf. Actually getting the double jump is very precise. I do see RTA runners doing it sometimes, which is very impressive, but pretty much it is like a little clip into the object or whatever it is. Now, if a gap is too wide to make, there's some other tools that we have, and one of those tools is this like wall clipping jumpy stuff. This is similar to what we saw in Cortex Power Skip when we were looking at the RTA section, but that gap there would have been too wide to jump, so that's why I go up on the wall instead. So cycles can be pretty brutal in this game, but as you can see, there are usually ways to break those cycles. That wall skip that I did, we'll also have to do a little bit later for the gem skip in this level as well. Actually, it's the previous river level, but basically there's a gem skip which has the wall jump again. So you can see double jumping across this leaf here, another double jump across there to get across, and we're going to wait until we get past all the boxes here. One little thing there is I broke that box without invincibility, which is a little bit faster because you don't have to watch the invincibility cutscene. And then we pretty much make our way to the end of the level, but here we can just do that wall jump there. It's not a full wall jump, basically we just get a sub jump off it and that's a little bit faster, but it gets us across that gem gap really easily. Speaking of gem skips, I do this jungle roller skip pretty much the same way. You'll notice that I'm not going to get invincibility before this skip. So normally the RTA runners have invincibility, it helps them break all the boxes, but with precise enough movement you can make this jump up here with Crash and break the boxes with spins. It's the tiniest bit slower than having invincibility because you can't break that big stack of boxes easily, but it does save a lot of time over watching the invincibility cutscene. One thing that I'll mention about this level is all the rolly things are on different cycles, and one way to get past those cycles is to damage boost through, but you're not going to know in advance how many Aku Aku masks you need until you know what cycles you're going to hit. So the trend with TASing Crash games is you often have to redo levels just to test things involving global cycles. They can be pretty grueling to optimize. Also, as I mentioned in the RTA section, unfortunately the rolling stone skip wasn't known at the time of making this TAS, so in this level I will do it in 2 trips in the TAS, and that loses about a minute and a half compared to what it could. So in theory we could make a new 100% TAS with rolling stone skip, although I was a bit burnt out at the end of making this TAS since it took months and months of work, so wasn't particularly in the mood to do that. Apart from that, the TAS pretty much does all the gem skips in the same way, just occasionally with faster variants on them. Like with this gem skip here, and I just jump over the end portal by jumping really carefully on the edge. RTA used to do that, but now they go over the top of the level, which is a little bit slower than what the TAS can do. Now, I won't talk too much about each individual level in the TAS, but just be aware that in both 100% and any%, there are lots of really cool levels and really big corner cuts. This one I like in particular because you get the invincibility, and this is one of the only times where invincibility is actually useful. One of the main reasons is because we've got to break a bunch of boxes, and the other one is because we got a damage boost off a lot of the scenery. If I tried to get Aku Aku masks for every single one of those damage boosts, then, well, I just simply wouldn't have enough. So it's worth taking the cutscene there. And the invincibility mask lasts exactly long enough for you to do this crazy jump over here and skip the little auto-scroller section. And the 100% TAS just ends on the Great Hall. It does a few little cheeky sub-jumps to skip it, but because we got all the gems, we can make this secret path and get to sort of the best ending of the game. So it's a bit weird, but we never fight Cortex in the 100% TAS. Yeah, and that's me done talking about the 100% and any% TAS, but how would you feel if I told you that every single TAS on TAS videos is incredibly suboptimal and loses a whole bunch of time compared to what optimal gameplay looks like? Now it's time to talk about zip-zagging. So what we're looking here is a TAS that I made in 25 minutes. That's 8 minutes faster than the published any% run, and it looks pretty broken. Yeah, Crash just builds up a lot of speed and just goes for a little zoom through the level here. Climbing sections are still slow, but then, bam, we just have all that speed, zoom past everything. The freezing that you're seeing is literally the game lagging to load the level as quick as it needs to. But that is the glitch called zip-zagging, and it's huge. This glitch can be used in every single level. All you need to do is gain a little bit of speed at the start, and then just launch Crash off in whatever direction you want. The camera's still locked on a particular path, so you have to follow the path of the level, but you keep gaining more and more speed throughout, and then eventually you just zoom through every little section that you need to. So this glitch is huge. It saves 8 minutes over any percent currently, and I have no idea how much time over 100%, but I'm sure it would be a lot. So the best way to explain the concept is, I guess, through an analogy. If you're familiar with Wind Waker and Super Swimming, it is essentially the same glitch, only the Crash one works everywhere. In Wind Waker, you're building up a whole bunch of negative speed by alternating the joystick direction while swimming, and that's exactly what happens in Crash. Now, this glitch is actually pretty easy to pull off in a TAS setting. All you need to do is jump, and then each frame you're alternating between sort of up left and down right. These are the two sort of diagonal directions on the stick. So the more alternations you do of this pattern, the better you're going to get. So you can have a look at the velocity watch on the bottom of the screen, but essentially that velocity is going negative every time we do this. If you land, you'll lose all that negative velocity eventually, but if you can keep chaining jumps off this, then that's actually going to allow you to build up more speed. So you can see here the velocity is now building up to -11, and we just keep this pattern going over and over and over again until we build up all the speed that we want. So there's a little bit of a trade-off here. It's a little bit tricky to figure out how much speed to build up at the start of each level, but pretty much you can build up as much as you want, and then when you're ready to let speed go, all you need to do is hold Crash away from the direction you want him to go, so in this case down, and you can see there he's already built up that little bit of speed, and then you can sort of chain jumps and stuff. You sort of retain the speed if you zigzag properly, so you can see here Crash is just like jumping there at a really fast pace. But if you want to build up any more speed, then you want to do that up left, down right pattern again. And usually this is really good during climbing sections. You build up the speed a little bit more there. But that's essentially the heart of how zigzagging works. Now, if you want to try this RTA, you are not going to have a good time because, well, this stuff's pretty much frame perfect alternation. If you go much slower, it just simply won't work. Although it is possible to do an RTA with pause buffering if you can get into a situation where you don't need to do jumps. One place that you can build up zip-zag speed RTA is in Crash 3 on these little trampoline things. The reason this is a good spot is because they got heaps of area so that if you drift side to side it doesn't really matter. And in theory you can do it RTA, but by the time you build up speed you might as well have just done the level normally. So if you look on TAS videos, you won't see any Crash 1 TASs using zip-zagging, but there are a couple of published Crash 3 TASs which use it. This one here is my TAS, which essentially does all the normal levels of the game, but just uses zip-zagging to make them go a lot faster. There's also an any percent TAS which uses something called the item glitch and zip-zagging to save a whole bunch of time and do it in like 6 or 7 minutes. But the TAS here, you can see Crash just builds up speed and zooms through the level. Key difference between Crash 1 and Crash 3 though is that Crash 3 actually has a cap on how fast the level can scroll. So no matter how fast Crash is moving, the level's going to have a cap scrolling speed there, and that made it actually possible to optimize zip-zagging in Crash 3. On Crash 1, on the other hand, you can move as fast as you want, so it's a bigger question about where to make that trade-off, and that's why when I made the Crash 1 version, it was just a low TAD and not an actual TAS. And fun fact, I actually found zip-zagging while just messing around in the tiny fight. I was trying to do some weird play around for entertainment, and I thought, what if you jump and sort of move back and forth? And then this happened, which is absolutely bizarre. So I'd encourage you, if you're TASing a game, to try all sorts of weird bits of movement, because you never know if you could find some tech that speeds up the entire game, like I did here. Now you might be wondering why we don't use zip-zagging in all Crash TASs, and essentially it's a speed entertainment trade-off. Zip-zagging looks really, really cool when you first see it, but then after that pretty much every level is exactly the same. You just build up speed and zoom to the end. People can't find it as relatable to their own experience playing Crash, which is why we get a lot better, I guess, audience retention in a less glitchy TAS that actually has normal movement. It does make me a little bit sad because I really like zigzagging, but I do understand this decision, and then in those Crash 1 Tazes that I made, like that 100% one recently, I've done it with normal movement because at the end of the day it's going to be a more enjoyable watch, and if we want a zigzagging Taz, well, we can just make that as well and have both as a comparison. Then you can watch whatever one you'd really prefer to watch. For example, just in Crash 3, this sort of any percent all levels one uses zigzagging to show how it can be done, but if you watch the 105% Taz, it uses normal movement. And just quickly coming back to the Crash 1 low tab that I made using the zigzagging, one thing that's really cool is you can clip past a lot of these doors and just zoom through the lab level, but what I really want to talk about is how the game ends. Pretty much all through this level I've been saying, wouldn't it be nice if we could skip the Great Hall and not have to fight Cortex at the end of an any percent run? And that's exactly what zigzagging allows us to do in Crash Bandicoot 1. So once this loads up, we're going to be able to see, we're going to zoom through that Great Hall with pretty much no gems collected. Unsurprisingly, all you really need to do is build up a whole bunch of speed using zigzagging. I do have that one gem there. But you build up a whole bunch of speed using zigzagging, and then you can make these jumps across the gaps without the gem platforms actually being there at all. So it saves a whole bunch of time in any percent, and it makes it for a really cool ending. What do you categorize this as? Any percent? 100%? Well, it's any percent because you didn't collect everything, but you got the 100% ending. It's a little bit strange. It would be cool if we could do zigzagging RTA and get this Great Hall skip, but I don't see it likely happening anytime particularly soon. Maybe one day. Anyway, that's going to be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed this sort of deep dive in Crash. If you did enjoy this, I've got a lot more on the channel, usually with games that are a little bit less well known, but I always give you an intro to the game beforehand anyway. If you enjoyed it, I'd appreciate a sub because it helps out the channel a whole bunch. And thanks so much for watching.